Modernism comes to China in the potent form of the writer Lu Xun, who begins his career essentially as a writer. He had been an editor and leading intellectual for some time, but he begins his career with a short story that he submitted to a magazine that some friends were publishing called Diary of a Madman, alternately translated sometimes as The Madman's Diary. The gist of this story is that it is a diary entry, or a series of diary entries by an insane person who stumbles across the belief that cannibalism is rampant in China and has been for some time. It's a funny little story. You can read it as a wicked satire, and it is. You can also read it as a bit of an allegory. You can read it a number of different ways, and the fact that there are so many different options and there is no real settled right way to read it is kind of the point. But we'll get there. The story is it begins as a kind of medical case study. Lu Xun studied as a doctor for a little while, but it begins in this very formal frame. It's sort of a frame tale again. He writes in a very ornate and stuffy classical Chinese this little introduction. And even in translation, translators can have a lot of fun with this. There was once a pair of male siblings whose actual names I beg your indulgence to withhold. Suffice it to say that we were 3 boon companions during our school years. Subsequently, circumstances contrived to rend us asunder so that we were gradually bereft of knowledge regarding each other's activities. A little arch, perhaps, a little formal, to talk about, well, these are the guys I hung out with when I was a kid and we lost touch. But it's written in this very classical Chinese, so this is sort of aping that. And then it sets up that the narrator is writing this, and he has sought out one of these 2 brothers that he was friends with, and he's not quite sure which one it is. There's a little indeterminacy there. But he finds out that one of them has had some psychological problems, perhaps a little bit of a breakdown. But now it's also a little unclear, but now has apparently been cured and has gone off to return to his career. All of this is a little vague, a little hard to decipher between all of the ornate language, but then once the diary entries begin, the diaries is written in vernacular, street lingo, if you will, and it is it's a 180 in terms of style, and it's much more fresh, it's much more alive, and it's much more immediate. So that shift is very conspicuous and is meant to sort of highlight certain themes, themes about the past. This story is primarily about the past. It is a clarion call to leave the old ways behind and embrace the new. Modernism. But the very first entry gives you a sense of where this guy is at in his diary. He says, moonlight's really nice tonight. Haven't seen it in over 30 years. Seeing it today, I feel like a new man. I know now that I've been completely out of things for the past 3 decades or more. But I've still got to be very careful. Otherwise, how do you explain those dirty looks the Zhao family dog gave me? the Zhao family dog. The dog is giving him dirty looks. This is our character. This is the Madman. This is Paranoia. Absolute seething, seeing everybody lining up against him, Paranoia. Particularly, he singles out. He tends to single out older people. Venerable old Zhao, this old father figure, is a repository of tradition and the grand patriarch, and he is particularly suspicious in this, in the mind of the Madman. So again, you get this sense of the older generation being somehow evil in some capacity. The diary goes on, and you see him sort of like, being very, again, paranoid, delusional. He starts talking about everybody exchanging secret signals around him that he doesn't quite get, but he can see that they're doing it. And then at one point, he sits down and he starts thinking about his education, Confucian classics, that he is, and the entire society is so well steeped in. They use this. This is their wisdom literature. This is their. This is everything for them. But he sees, he imagines reading a history. He says there were no dates in this history, but scrawled this way and that across every page were the words benevolence, righteousness, and morality. Confucianism is just soaked with those themes. Since I couldn't get to sleep anyway, I read that history very carefully for most of the night, and finally I began to make out that what was written between the lines, the whole volume was filled with a single phrase: eat people. And so, now we have a more explicit reference to classical literature, if you will, the literature of the past. Whereas the beginning just had the style of classical Chinese, contraposed to the immediacy of the vernacular once the diary gets kicking. Now we have that this guy is imagining reading through classical literature and finding between the lines. Now, you can talk about however you want to interpret that. Is it actually written in tiny ink between lines? Is it, is he seeing like letters jump out at him from in the middle of words to combine into these words? I don't know. I suspect it's just him reading it and sensing a new theme, reading into it what he will. The Confucian classics, thus, are subject to alternative readings. This is modernism. There is no stable reading mode. There is no absolute truth to be discerned from literature. The literature is open to interpretation, and thus divergent interpretation. And so this is where he is at. He is seeing that, well, this is telling me to eat people. He goes on and on, it's all right there, it's written in the books, this is culture, and he sees it as this great parasitic culture within China. This reverence for the past, this reverence for the classics, for the established way of doing things. Now, at this time, China was in a little bit of a rut, having been the primary authority culturally in Asia for millennia at this point. It was really starting to fall behind a little bit. Japan had greatly modernized and was essentially outpacing on the world stage, let's say, China. Japan was much more forward-thinking in the arts, much more imperialist and expansionist in its political and military gains. It was fighting a war with Russia. It was soon to go into the 20th century, and we all know where that led. China was a little bit stuck in the past by comparison, and this is written soon after Lu Xun had abandoned his medical studies in Japan, where he had seen firsthand, like, the second tier that China had slipped to relative to Japan, and he felt a little nationalist pride that he wanted to try and nudge them along and do it for country. He became very much co-opted by. He was a supporter of the Mao Zedong and the Republican takeover, the overthrow of the dynasty system, and he became adopted, essentially culturally adopted, as a great writer of the truth by Mao Zedong, which leads to certain issues with propaganda and other stuff that he probably wouldn't have been on board with if he had lived. But there is that nationalist impulse saying, come on, guys, let's get our act together. Let's scrape off this pernicious past. He says, again and again, he's driving home this point that we need to embrace something new. We need to get rid of our unhealthy attachment to the classical past. He says, even though people may say it's always been like this, we can still do our best to improve, and we can start today. He's driving this point again and again and again. There is, of course, an implicit irony and trouble in that this is the madman saying this. This is clearly an imbalanced person. The paranoia is all over the place. You cannot not see it. But he's the one who sees the truth. This goes to, the lovers of Madman have such seizing minds that apprehend more than they comprehend. The idea that the madman has some sort of oracular power to see the problems of society in some special acuity, that's been around for a long time. But it's still like, well, you can just write it off and say, well, he's insane. And if I agree with him, well, now wait a minute, does that mean I'm insane? But if I dispel him, am I part of the problem? Clearly there is some issues with clinging to the past, but where do I fit in with this? These are the questions we're all supposed to ask. These are the questions that ultimately there is no set answer to, and this is modernism. There is no one way of reading anything. There is no absolute truth. There is no objective world that we can all just agree on. It is inherently unstable. It is inherently conflicted. And this gives modernism its fun.